The winter of 1942 settled over Brooklyn like a heavy gray blanket, muffling the sounds of the streetcars and softening the edges of the row houses where families huddled around radios for the latest war news. Raymond Sullivan woke before sunrise each morning, not because he enjoyed the cold, but because the neighborhood factory whistle dictated the rhythm of his life. He was 22, thin from rationing, and always looked slightly tired, as though the war had aged him even though he had not yet worn a uniform. He lived with his mother, Mary, who had already lost one brother in the Great War and feared the world was determined to take more from her. Raymond tried to shield her from the darkest headlines, but she heard everything. Whispers from neighbors, letters read aloud by widows in the hallway, and the radio announcers describing distant battles with a clinical, unwavering tone. Raymond's days were spent inside the naval munitions plant near the East River. The clang of machinery echoed endlessly, and the oily smell clung to his clothes long after he returned home. He and the other young men worked with relentless precision, assembling casings, bolts, and parts for ships fighting in places most of them had never heard of before the war. Everyone understood that mistakes cost lives, and the supervisors reminded them constantly that America needed speed, strength, and sacrifice. But Raymond carried a quiet guilt. He felt safe while boys his age were bleeding on beaches in the Pacific. He wrote to his childhood friend Joseph, who had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. Joseph's letters arrived sporadically, stained with sweat and dust, full of descriptions Raymond read carefully but never shared with his mother. In one, Joseph described nights so loud with artillery that even sleep felt dangerous. In another, he spoke of a Marine who had held a photo of his daughter until the moment he died. Raymond folded these letters and hid them away, unsure whether the words made him more grateful or more ashamed. In the spring of 1943, a telegram arrived at the factory. Workers gathered in tense silence as a foreman read the notice. Production demands were increasing sharply, and certain skilled laborers were being drafted despite their essential positions. Raymond felt the air leave his lungs when his name appeared on the list. The foreman shook his head, muttering something about the government taking men he couldn't afford to lose, but the decision was final. Raymond had expected this moment someday, but the reality struck harder than he imagined. When he told his mother, she sat down slowly, as though someone had pulled a chair from beneath her, and she needed to catch herself before falling. Training was a blur, long marches across muddy fields, the sting of cold rain, sergeants who barked orders with voices that scraped like metal. Raymond wasn't the strongest recruit, but he learned quickly. He listened closely, studied maps, practiced firing until the rifle felt like an extension of his arm. At night he lay awake in the barracks listening to the snores, sighs, and whispered prayers of the men around him. Some were eager for battle, convinced of heroism. Others, like Raymond, simply felt responsibility pressing heavily on their shoulders. Before he shipped out, he returned home for a final week. Mary tried her best to smile, cooking his favorite meals despite ration limits. Neighbors dropped by with small gifts, a pair of wool socks, a pocket prayer book, a folded American flag that had belonged to a grandfather. Raymond didn't know how to respond to their kindness except with quiet gratitude. He walked through familiar streets, memorizing the sound of the elevated train and the smell of fresh bread from the corner bakery. He wanted to carve those moments into memory, something warm to carry across the ocean. The ship that carried him to Europe in early 1944 was crowded with soldiers from every state. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, sons of fishermen from Maine. Raymond bonded with two men in particular. Harris, a tall, sarcastic man who hid his fear behind jokes, and Martinez, a soft-spoken Texan who wrote love letters every night by flashlight. They became Raymond's closest companions during training drills on the ship deck, shared meals, and whispered conversations in the dark when the waves rocked the vessel too hard for sleep. In England, the months before deployment were consumed by preparation. Endless marching through rolling fields, learning to navigate forests, practicing radio codes, crawling beneath barbed wire under the crack of simulated gunfire. The officers drilled into them the importance of teamwork. No man could survive the battlefield alone. Raymond wrote frequent letters home, though he never described the fear that crept into his chest each time rumors spread about the coming invasion. Then came June of 1944. The channel was stormy, the sky low and heavy, and the air electric with dread. Raymond's unit was among those assigned to land at Omaha Beach. As their landing craft churned through the rough water, Raymond clutched the strap of his helmet and tried to slow his breathing. Harris cracked a joke, something about owing him a beer if they survived long enough to drink again, but his voice trembled. Martinez kissed a photograph and tucked it into his jacket. When the ramp dropped, chaos erupted. Bullets tore through the air like metal rain. Men stumbled, slipped, fell, some plunging into the surf, some not rising again. Raymond pushed forward instinctively, remembering the training, keeping his head low as explosions sent sand and seawater flying. His ears rang and his heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst. He saw soldiers dragged under waves, wounded men crying for medics, and ahead, the jagged outline of German defenses looming like monstrous shadows. Somehow he reached cover behind a shattered obstacle. Harris collapsed beside him, gasping, his helmet dented from a glancing strike. Martinez scrambled over a moment later, panting but alive. Raymond felt heat flood his body, fear, adrenaline, disbelief. They were still here, they were still fighting. Hours dragged into something timeless, a blur of smoke, shouting, advancing inch by inch. Raymond fired until his shoulder ached, crawled across debris, carried a wounded private to safety despite machine gun fire slicing through the air. He didn't think, he simply acted, clinging to survival with every frantic breath. When the beach was finally secured, the sun had begun to sink, casting long red streaks over the water as though marking the cost of victory. From Normandy onward, Raymond's war became a march across villages and forests where danger hid behind every doorway and every tree. He saw moments of horror, but also acts of compassion that softened the brutality. The medic who treated enemy prisoners with equal care, the French family who risked their lives to shelter American soldiers, the moments of laughter shared around small campfires when they tried to remember the world they had left behind. Months later, during a bitterly cold morning in Belgium, Raymond and his unit came under sudden attack during what would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge. The forest erupted with explosions, trees cracked like bones. Raymond became separated from Harris and Martinez in the confusion. He took shelter behind a fallen log as snow mixed with smoke in the air. Somewhere in the distance, he heard shouting German voices, American voices, blending into a single desperate rhythm. Through the haze, he spotted a young German soldier lying wounded, barely more than a boy. Raymond hesitated only a moment before crawling toward him. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, but he did not raise his weapon. Raymond bound his bleeding leg, offering what little comfort he could before dragging him to a safer position. War had taught Raymond the value of humanity, even amid violence. By nightfall, American reinforcements arrived. Harris emerged from the darkness, bruised but smiling weakly. Martinez was found later, wounded but alive. Raymond felt something inside him loosen, a knot he hadn't realized had tightened with every mile they'd marched. When the war ended, Raymond returned home to Brooklyn. The neighborhood looked smaller, quieter, changed in ways both subtle and enormous. Mary embraced him so tightly he thought she might never let go. He carried with him memories heavier than any duffel bag, faces of friends lost, landscapes scarred, promises whispered in the dark. But he also carried hope. The world had survived its darkest hour, and so had he. Raymond found work again, this time in rebuilding rather than destroying. He married a girl he had known since childhood, raised children who grew up without the sound of bombs in the distance, and kept in touch with Harris and Martinez for decades. In quiet moments, he would sit by the window, watching the streets he had once memorized before crossing the ocean. He never forgot the fear, the courage, the cold mornings, or the warm laughter shared with men who had become brothers. He never forgot why they fought, not for glory, but for the chance to come home to mornings like these, where sunlight touched brick walls gently and the world felt possible again. And though the war had taken something from him, it had also given him a deeper understanding of life. That ordinary people, when pushed into extraordinary circumstances, could rise with a strength they never knew they possessed. Years passed quietly, but the memories did not fade. They only settled deeper, like ink sinking into old paper. Raymond found himself awakening some nights in a cold sweat, hearing echoes of gunfire in the stillness of his room. Mary would step in silently, sit beside him, and place a gentle hand on his shoulder. She never asked him to explain. She understood that the war had carved pieces out of him that words could not easily restore. Brooklyn in the late 1940s was a city rebuilding itself. Streets buzzed with new bobbies, new shops, new hope. Returning veterans gathered at corner bars, swapping stories, laughing too loudly about things that had once terrified them. Sometimes Raymond joined them, listening more than speaking. Other times he simply walked along the harbor, feeling the wind brush across his face as ships rolled slowly over the waves, ships that now carried families and goods instead of frightened soldiers. In 1949, he met Alina, a school teacher who had moved to the neighborhood to be closer to her sister. She had a gentle voice and a smile that arrived slowly, like sunrise easing across the horizon. They met at a bakery one morning when Raymond accidentally reached for the same loaf she wanted. She laughed softly and said he could have it, but he insisted they split it, then offered to walk her home because the bag she carried looked heavy. That walk lasted an hour. They spoke about everyday things at first, the price of bread, the noise of the city, the weather. But soon their conversations eased into deeper waters. Alina listened with genuine interest when he spoke of the factory work, his childhood friend Joseph, the streets of Normandy, the cold forests of Belgium. She never flinched or asked intrusive questions. She simply listened, her eyes steady and warm. They married the next year in a small church with chipped paint and an organ that wheezed louder than it sang. Harris came in a suit that didn't quite fit, grinning proudly. Martinez arrived all the way from Texas, carrying a wooden box containing a hand-carved eagle he had made for Raymond as a wedding gift. They toasted with cheap wine, danced clumsily, and laughed until their sides hurt. Raymond and Alina moved into a small apartment overlooking a narrow alley where children played stickball. Nights were quiet, filled with the soft scrape of Alina's pen as she graded papers and the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the stove. When their first child, Thomas, was born, Raymond held him with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the fragile weight of new life. He whispered a promise he wasn't sure the baby could understand, that he would do everything in his power to give him a peaceful world. Years unfolded like pages. Thomas grew into a talkative boy who loved building toy airplanes and running through the hallways with a wooden dog on a string. A few years later, their daughter Margaret arrived, her cries somehow gentler, her curiosity sharper. The Sullivan home filled with noise and laughter, and Raymond often found himself pausing to absorb the simple beauty of it. Sunlight spilling across the kitchen table, children arguing over crayons, Alina humming as she prepared dinner. Still, the past remained a quiet shadow. Sometimes Raymond dropped an object when a car backfired outside. Sometimes he stared too long at the horizon, lost somewhere far away. But Alina understood, and the children grew up knowing only that their father had seen difficult things long before they were born. In the early 1960s, as Thomas approached adulthood, Raymond saw familiar uncertainty in his son's eyes. News from abroad grew tense again, whispers of conflict in distant jungles. One evening, Thomas came home with a pamphlet about military service. He said he wanted to help his country the way his father had. Raymond felt the room spin. He sat his son down and spoke more honestly than he ever had before. He told Thomas that courage wasn't found in marching off to war, but in choosing a path that helped others without destroying oneself. He explained that he hadn't fought because he wanted to, but because circumstances had left him no choice. He described the faces of friends who never came home and the weight of loss that followed men long after the battles ended. Thomas listened quietly, and in the end, he folded the pamphlet and placed it in a drawer he never opened again. By the time Raymond reached old age, the world had changed in ways he could never have imagined. Colored televisions in every living room, rockets flying into space, phones that no longer required cords. Yet he remained the same quiet man who rose early, drank his coffee slowly, and walked to the harbor whenever the weather allowed. One autumn morning, after Alina had passed away and the apartment felt too silent, Raymond received a letter from a young filmmaker who had discovered records of his unit. The filmmaker asked if Raymond would be willing to speak about his experiences for a documentary. At first he declined. The wounds felt too personal, too sacred. But that night he dreamed of the faces of young men who had fought beside him. Harris Martinez, the medic who had sung softly while stitching wounds, the German boy he had saved in the snow. He realized their stories deserved to be remembered. So he agreed. When the filmmaker arrived, Raymond sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea, speaking slowly, carefully, as though handling fragile memories. He told of the cold beaches, the fear, the strange moments of beauty amid destruction. He spoke of comradeship, of the unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of war. He spoke of returning home and learning to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. The filmmaker listened with deep respect, capturing every word. After the interview ended, Raymond stepped outside. The evening light fell over Brooklyn in soft golden ribbons. Children played in the alleyway below, their laughter rising into the air. A distant ship horn echoed across the harbor. Raymond breathed in deeply, feeling a peace he hadn't felt in years. He realized that despite everything he had endured, despite the scars that time could never fully heal, he had lived a full life. A life shaped by war, but defined by love, family, resilience, and quiet strength. And as he watched the world continue in all its imperfect beauty, he felt grateful. Not for the battles fought, but for the days that came after, for the chance to grow old in a world that had once seemed determined to tear itself apart. Winter came again, the kind that wrapped the city in a slow, fragile stillness. Raymond felt the cold more sharply in his bones now, moving a bit slower than he once had, but still determined to walk each day. The documentary the young filmmaker released began circulating quietly among veterans' halls, local libraries, and community centers. Raymond never sought recognition, but letters began arriving, some from families of soldiers who served in his division, others from students who said his words helped them understand the human weight of history. Raymond read each letter slowly, pausing often, humbled by how deeply strangers cared about events that had shaped him so long ago. One letter stood out. It came from a man in Germany named Lucas. The handwriting was neat, careful. Lucas wrote that his grandfather had once spoken of an American soldier who saved his life in the snow during the final winter of the war. His grandfather had described the soldier as gentle-eyed, young, trembling with cold, but refusing to abandon him. Lucas believed that soldier might have been Raymond. The letter ended with gratitude passed
down through generations. Raymond stared at the paper for a long time, feeling something shift inside him. For 80 years he had carried the weight of that memory, of choosing mercy in a place where mercy was rare. To know that the boy had survived, lived, raised a family, and shared that moment, it felt like a small light flickering in an old, dark corner of Raymond's heart. He wrote back carefully, describing what he remembered. Weeks later, Lucas replied with a photograph of his grandfather as an old man, smiling from a balcony with two great-grandchildren perched beside him. Raymond kept that photo on his nightstand. The years continued their patient march. Thomas became an engineer, building bridges in states Raymond had never visited, and Margaret pursued medicine, caring for families the way Raymond and Alina had cared for their own. They visited often, guiding their children by the hand as they ran excitedly into their grandfather's arms. He taught the little ones how to fold paper boats, how to skip stones in the park, how to listen to the city's heartbeat from a quiet stoop. Sometimes they asked about the war, but Raymond always answered gently, focusing on the friendships, the bravery, the humanity, not the darkness. On his 85th birthday, Thomas and Margaret organized a small gathering at a community center near the pier. Friends, neighbors, and a few surviving men from his old unit attended, though time had thinned their ranks considerably. Martinez, now walking with a cane and a slow, deliberate gait, embraced Raymond with tears in his eyes. They sat together for hours, reminiscing about the days when they were young and terrified and somehow brave at the same time. Late in the evening, as the celebration wound down, Martinez leaned toward Raymond and whispered that he never forgot how Raymond had crawled into enemy fire to pull a wounded man to safety. It wasn't something Raymond had talked about much, dismissing it as simply doing what needed to be done. But hearing it now, spoken by one of the few who had witnessed it, made his throat tighten with emotion he had long buried. After the party, Raymond walked out to the pier alone. The night was calm, waves tapping gently against the wooden posts. The skyline shimmered in the distance, taller and brighter than ever, a far cry from the city he had known as a boy. He leaned on the railing, listening to the soft creaking of the harbor. He thought of Alina, of Harris, of the men who never came home, of the German boy who had lived, of the long, extraordinary journey of ordinary people. The next few years unfolded peacefully. Raymond grew slower, but his mind remained clear and sharp. He still received letters, still told stories to his grandchildren, still walked whenever he could. But one spring morning, as he sat by the window watching the first blossoms appear on the trees, he felt a deep tiredness settle over him, a gentle invitation rather than a fear. He passed quietly in his sleep that night, the city humming softly outside his window. The news rippled through the neighborhood. The small church filled once again with people, children he had taught to sail paper boats, neighbors who had grown old alongside him, veterans who saluted his photo with trembling hands. Thomas and Margaret spoke of their father's gentle patience, his quiet strength, his unwavering love. But what surprised them most was the number of strangers who attended, students who had seen the documentary, families of soldiers who had written him letters. Even Lucas, the German man, traveled across the ocean to pay his respects, carrying a bouquet of white flowers and a small framed photo of his grandfather, the boy Raymond had saved in the snow. After the service, Lucas approached Thomas and Margaret, tears in his eyes, and thanked them for sharing their father with the world. He said his grandfather had always believed that one act of compassion could change the course of many lives, and Raymond had proven that to be true. When the gathering ended, Thomas and Margaret stood beside the pier, watching the water shimmer beneath the setting sun. They felt sadness, of course, but also something warm, pride in the legacy their father left behind. Not a legacy of medals or grand speeches, but of kindness, resilience, and quiet courage. They stayed until the sky turned deep blue, listening to the soft pulse of the harbor. And in the gentle rocking of the waves, they felt their father's presence, steady, strong, everlasting, carried across time like a memory that refuses to fade. In the months following Raymond's passing, his family slowly learned how to navigate the quiet spaces he once filled. The apartment felt emptier, but not hollow, more like a room where sunlight lingers after someone has stepped outside. Thomas and Margaret sorted through his belongings carefully, not because they needed to. Raymond had lived simply, but because each item felt like a thread in the long tapestry of his life. One afternoon, Margaret discovered a small wooden box tucked behind old letters in a drawer. Inside were carefully folded notes, some yellowed with age, others still crisp. They were from Joseph, Raymond's childhood friend who had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. Margaret had heard the name in passing, but hadn't realized how deeply their friendship ran. One letter, dated months before Joseph's death, described memories of running along the Brooklyn docks as children, daring each other to jump into the cold water. Another described the fear and exhaustion at the front, written with such honesty that Margaret found herself wiping tears from her cheeks. At the bottom of the box, she found a final unopened envelope addressed to Raymond, delivered long after Joseph had fallen. The military had returned it, stamped with the word deceased. Margaret held the letter for a long time, feeling the weight of two young men's hopes and fears sealed within. She decided not to open it. Some memories, she believed, belonged to the past and should remain untouched, preserved like fragile relics. Meanwhile, Thomas discovered something unexpected, an unfinished journal Raymond had kept during his later years. It wasn't a war diary. Instead, it spoke about his children, his love for Alina, his friendships with Harris and Martinez, the lessons he wished he could
Pass on to the younger generation. There were reflections on forgiveness, on grief, on the strange way life could drift forward even after the world had shattered. Thomas found entries written after Raymond had received Lucas's letter. In those entries, Raymond described feeling a quiet peace he hadn't known he still needed. The confirmation that an act of kindness had bloomed into generations of life and gratitude. Inspired, Thomas and Margaret decided to work together on something they believed their father would have appreciated. A book, not a dramatic war memoir, but a gentle story of an ordinary man who lived through extraordinary times. They gathered his letters, his journal entries, stories from Martinez's family, recorded interviews from the filmmaker, and memories from neighbors who had known him since he was a young man with all-stained hands walking home from the factory. When the book was published, modest, simply titled Raymond's Quiet War, it surprised them by reaching far beyond Brooklyn. Teachers used it in history classes. Veterans recommended it to younger soldiers. Families wrote to say that the book reminded them of their own fathers and grandfathers who rarely spoke of the wars they survived. Even Lucas received a copy, and he shared it with his own children, telling them that one man's kindness during a brutal winter had made their entire family possible. The book eventually found its way into a small museum in Belgium, dedicated to the Battle of the Bulge, placed under a glass case beside a map marking the forest where Raymond had once crawled through snow to save a boy who was supposed to be his enemy. As years turned into decades, Raymond's grandchildren grew. They carried forward not just his stories, but his way of looking at the world with patience, empathy, and a belief that even small acts could ripple across generations. Thomas's son Michael became a teacher who encouraged curiosity and compassion in his students. Margaret's daughter Anne studied international relations, inspired by her grandfather's belief that understanding people was the only way to prevent future wars. One summer, Anne traveled to Europe for her studies. She visited the museum where her grandfather's story was displayed. Standing before the glass case, she felt a strange sense of connection, as if the cold forest, the distant gunfire, and her grandfather's trembling hands existed in the silence around her. A guide, noticing her lingering gaze, explained the story of the American who saved the German boy, unaware that she was his granddaughter. Anne didn't interrupt. She simply listened, letting the guide's voice fill the room, letting the weight of history settle gently on her shoulders. Later, she visited the very forest where Raymond had once dragged the wounded boy to safety. The trees were tall and quiet now, branches swaying softly in the breeze. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the ground. She knelt and touched the earth, feeling the coolness seep into her palm. It was hard to imagine the fear, the chaos, the burning cold that once filled this place. But she felt close to her grandfather in that moment, closer than she ever had. When she returned to Brooklyn, she carried with her a small glass jar of soil from the forest. She placed it beside Raymond's photo on the shelf in her mother's living room. A connection between past and present, between war and peace, between a young soldier in 1944 and the family that existed because he had refused to let hatred guide him. Time continued onward as it always does. New generations were born, old ones passed, and the world changed in ways even Raymond could not have imagined. But his story, quiet, humble, human, lived on. It lived in the students who read his book. It lived in the museum visitors who paused before the glass case. It lived in Lucas's descendants. It lived in the soil Anne brought home. It lived in the Sullivan family, carried forward like a lantern. Raymond had once feared he would be forgotten, one soldier among thousands. But he became something far greater. A reminder that history is not shaped only by grand battles and famous leaders, but by the steady courage of ordinary people who choose compassion when darkness surrounds them. And in the quiet moments when his descendants stood by the harbor and listened to the soft whisper of the waves, they felt him still. A gentle presence, watching, guiding, and reminding them that even the smallest kindness can echo across a lifetime. Years drifted onward, soft but steady, and the Sullivan family expanded into branches that Raymond never had the chance to meet. Michael's children grew up hearing stories about the grandfather who had crossed an ocean and returned a different man, yet built a life full of patience and quiet strength. Anne, now older, pursued her studies with a fervor that surprised even herself. She became determined to understand how ordinary people found courage in impossible circumstances, and how compassion survived in the face of brutality. She eventually earned a place in an international peacekeeping research institute, where she focused on stories of civilians who risked their lives to help strangers during wartime. Her grandfather's influence guided every word she wrote, even when she didn't mention his name. Anne traveled frequently: Bosnia, Rwanda, Poland, Japan, places where echoes of war lingered in silent memorials and the eyes of survivors. Yet no matter how far she traveled, she always returned to Brooklyn, to the harbor where Raymond once stood and watched ships glide over the water. The pier became her place of clarity. She often leaned on the railing just the way he used to, staring into the shimmering ripples, imagining the young soldier who had crossed this very water so many decades earlier. One autumn evening, as leaves blew across the pier and the sky turned a deep amber, Anne received an email from Lucas. He was now a father, his hair flecked with gray, but his gratitude for the American soldier who saved his grandfather had never faded. He invited Anne to an upcoming commemoration event in Germany honoring civilians and soldiers whose acts of mercy had changed the course of individual lives during the war. Raymond's name was listed among them. Anne felt something warm swell inside her chest. She accepted the invitation. When she arrived in Germany months later, she was welcomed by Lucas and his family as though she were long-lost kin. The ceremony was held in a small hall near the forest where Raymond had once dragged a wounded boy from the snow. Photographs lined the walls, faces of men and women from both sides of the conflict who had risked everything to save others. Raymond's picture, taken when he was young and thin and serious-eyed, stood among them. A single candle flickered beneath it. Lucas approached the podium and told his grandfather's story, how he had believed for decades that the American soldier who saved him represented a kind of humanity that war tried to extinguish but could never fully erase. He spoke of the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who existed because of that moment. Then he introduced Anne, inviting her to share a few words. She stepped forward, heart-pounding, unsure whether she could speak without her voice breaking. But when she looked at her grandfather's photo, steadiness filled her. She spoke not of battles or medals, but of Raymond's quiet fear, his doubt, his guilt at surviving when others did not. She spoke of how he raised his children to choose empathy over anger, of how he taught them that strength was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. And she spoke of how his single act of kindness had rippled outward, connecting families across oceans and generations. When she finished, the hall was silent in the way that follows great emotion. Lucas's mother embraced her tightly. Others approached with tears in their eyes, thanking her for sharing a story that reminded them of their own families, of grandparents who had been both victims and rescuers, enemies and friends, depending on the day, the moment, the choice. After the ceremony, Anne walked alone into the forest. It was late afternoon, sunlight filtering through the branches like long golden ribbons. She reached the small clearing where the wounded boy had once lain in the snow. The ground was carpeted in leaves, now peaceful and quiet. She knelt and placed her hand on the earth, imagining her grandfather crawling through the frost, exhausted, terrified, yet unwilling to abandon another human being. She whispered a thank you, not for the war, but for the goodness he had managed to protect within himself despite it. When Anne returned to Brooklyn, she brought with her a smooth stone she had picked up from the clearing. She placed it beside the jar of soil on the shelf, a growing collection of small, wordless reminders of the past. The Sullivan family grew older. Margaret retired from medicine and spent her mornings tending a small garden behind her building. Thomas traveled, visiting places he had once only read about. The grandchildren became adults, each carrying a fragment of Raymond's legacy in their hearts without always realizing it. One summer, Anne organized a family reunion. It was held near the harbor, where long tables were set up under strings of glowing lights. Children ran along the water's edge, adults laughed over shared memories, and the air carried a warm seaside breeze. Lucas and his family even made the trip, joining the Sullivans as though they had always been part of the clan. As night fell, Anne suggested they all walk to the edge of the pier. Together, dozens of people, descendants of Raymond, descendants of the boy he saved, friends old and new, stood facing the shimmering lights on the water. Anne raised her glass and spoke softly, her voice carried gently by the night air. This, she said, all of this exists because one man chose compassion when he could have chosen fear. The crowd fell silent, listening to the waves lap against the wooden posts. And that, she continued, is the kind of legacy that lasts. Far out on the water, a ship horn sounded, a long, slow note that drifted toward them like a memory. And though the night was dark, the pier glowed softly as if holding on to the last warmth of the sun, carrying Raymond's presence in every whisper of the tide, every flicker of starlight reflected in the harbor's gentle waves. Raymond wakes with a start. The engines hum steady, but his heart races. For a moment he thinks the ship is under attack, yet everything is calm. The deck outside is quiet except for the soft crunch of boots and the occasional murmur from the night watch. He lies back down, staring at the dim shapes of bunks around him, trying to convince himself it was only a dream. But the sound of rushing water and the image of the swamped Higgins boat linger, refusing to fade. Morning brings drills, cleaning, and more drills. The monotony leaves little room for thought, which Raymond is grateful for. As the day wears on, he notices Private Nichols sitting alone near a coil of rope, staring out at the horizon like he's searching for something that isn't there. Raymond approaches. Raymond, you all right? Nichols. Yeah, just thinking. Raymond. About Holmes. Nichols shakes his head. NICHOLS. About what it's gonna look like when we get wherever we're going. They don't tell us much, just prepare for engagement. RAYMOND. Maybe that's all there is to know. Nichols gives a quiet laugh. NICHOLS. You ever feel like the ocean's too big? Like if we fell off the map right now, no one would even know where to look. Raymond sits beside him. RAYMOND. Someone would know, someone always knows. Nichols nods, unconvinced. That night the men gather near the bow to catch a rare movie reel projected on a sheet. The projector crackles, the image flickering, a black and white comedy short. Laughter fills the salt air. Raymond watches the faces around him instead of the film, boys pretending to be men, clinging to anything that feels normal. Corporal Hagen hands out letters from home afterward. Raymond's name isn't called. Again, he tells himself it's fine, Mary's working extra hours, writing when she can. Still, the empty feeling grows. Days pass, the ocean stretches endlessly, training intensifies, officers bark orders from dawn to dusk. The ship finally slows one morning, shuddering under Raymond's feet. A murmur spreads among the men. Raymond climbs up to the weather deck. Ahead lies a faint dark line land. Sergeant Mason shouts for the platoon to assemble. Mason, listen up, this is the Marshall Islands. Our job is simple, get ashore, secure the landing zone, push forward until you're told otherwise. You keep your head down, follow the man in front of you, and for God's sake don't break formation. Raymond grips his rifle tighter. Nichols stands beside him, breathing fast. NICHOLS. This is it, how? RAYMOND. Yeah. The Higgins boats drop into the water with a heavy splash. Raymond steps inside, crouching low as the motor growls to life. The smell of diesel mixes with salt. Rain begins to fall, thin, cold needles. The shoreline grows larger. Palm trees whip in the wind. Machine gun fire cracks in the distance. The ramp slams down. Chaos erupts. Marines surge into chest-deep surf. Bullets ricochet off the metal hulls. Sand explodes in bursts ahead of them. Raymond charges forward, legs burning, the weight of his gear dragging him down. He reaches the beach and throws himself behind a jagged coral formation. Nichols tumbles beside him, gasping. NICHOLS. They didn't say it'd be this hot, Jesus. RAYMOND. Save your breath, move when I say. They sprint to the next cover, screams echo along the beach. A medic drags a wounded man backward, shouting for morphine. Raymond barely sees faces, just flashes of fear, determination, and the raw instinct to keep moving. They push inland, feet sinking into muddy undergrowth. The air is thick, humid, suffocating. Every few steps, gunfire erupts from concealed bunkers. The Marines return fire, grenades arcing through the foliage. In one bombardment, a tree trunk shatters, splinters whipping into Raymond's arm. He winces but keeps going. The squad moves as one, slowly gaining ground. By late afternoon, the fighting eases. Smoke drifts through the ruined palms. A small clearing becomes their temporary camp. The men collapse where they stand. Nichols sits with his helmet off, sweat dripping down his face. He looks at Raymond, eyes trembling. NICHOLS. We made it through the first day. RAYMOND. Yeah, first day. Nichols swallows hard. NICHOLS. You think it gets easier? Raymond shakes his head. RAYMOND. But we keep going, that's what we do. The sky darkens. A strange stillness falls over the jungle, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery from another company. Raymond leans back against a broken tree stump, exhaustion settling into his bones. He wants to sleep but can't. The dream of the sinking boat returns unbidden, mixing with real screams, real explosions. He looks at the men around him, mud-streaked, bloodied, terrified, and knows morning will bring more of the same. Still, he forces himself to breathe steady, to stay awake, to stay alive. Night presses in around them, thick and heavy. Raymond lowers his head, whispers to no one. RAYMOND. Ma, I hope you're praying. I'm trying. The jungle answers with silence. The night deepens, sticky and restless. The Marines whisper in low tones while others drift into uneasy sleep. Raymond remains awake, listening to the constant hum of insects and the distant pop of sporadic gunfire. Every sound feels amplified, as if the darkness itself is watching. A faint rustling cuts through the noise. Raymond stiffens, gripping his rifle. Nichols, half asleep beside him, jolts upright. NICHOLS. What was that? RAYMOND. Quiet. The rustling grows sharper. A shadow moves between the trees. Mason signals with 2 fingers, hold position. Silence stretches like a taut wire. Then a cry rings out from the far edge of the camp, a startled shout followed by rapid gunfire. The entire squad snaps into action. Mason, contact front defensive line move. Raymond and Nichols dive into position behind a fallen log as bullets zip through the foliage. The first wave of enemy soldiers charges from the dark, silhouettes darting between the undergrowth. The Marines fire in controlled bursts. The muzzle flashes flicker like lightning, revealing glimpses of terrified faces, sweat, smoke. Raymond's heart hammers. He squeezes the trigger, the recoil shaking through his arms. A figure collapses in front of him. He doesn't stop to see who. Nichols fumbles with a reload. Nichols. They're coming from everywheres. Raymond. Stay low. More screams echo through the camp as the Marines push back the attack. A grenade lands near a supply crate. Mason kicks it away with a shout. It detonates in a flash, showering dirt and leaves across the clearing. The gunfire seems endless, until suddenly it is. The jungle quiets. The attackers retreat, shadows melting back into the trees. The Marines hold position, gasping for breath. Mason, eyes up, no one sleeps tonight. Raymond wipes sweat and grime from his brow. His hands tremble. Nichols sits frozen, staring at the ground. Raymond. You'll hit. Nichols shakes his head slowly. Nichols. No, I didn't think night would feel worse than the day. Raymond doesn't answer. He feels it too, the weight of what just happened, the knowledge that it could happen again at any moment. Hours crawl by, dawn finally breaks, pale and heavy. The squad moves out, pushing deeper into the interior. The ground is slick with dew and ash. The smell of burnt foliage clings to everything. By midday, they reach a narrow ridge. Below stretches a fortified enemy position. Trenches, bunkers, a communications tower rising above the canopy. Mason, this is the objective. Intel says this outpost is coordinating enemy movements on the island. We take it out, the whole sector weakens. The Marines spread out, taking cover behind boulders and thick roots. Artillery from offshore begins pounding the target. Explosions bloom across the ridge, shaking the ground. Raymond advances cautiously with his squad. Bullets crack overhead. Splinters rain down. The air is a choking mix of smoke and dust. Nichols moves beside him, eyes narrowed with determination now instead of fear. They reach the first trench. Mason tosses a grenade inside. A dull thud follows. The squad jumps in, clearing the narrow pathway. Farther ahead, a bunker spews machine gun fire, pinning down the second platoon. Raymond spots a gap along the right flank. Raymond. Mason, I can get close. Mason hesitates, then nods. Mason, take Nichols, move fast. Raymond and Nichols cut low through the brush, circling toward the bunker. The machine gun rattles relentlessly, chewing up the earth where Marines try to advance. Raymond signals silently. Nichols swallows hard and nods. Together they sprint the last few feet, sliding behind the bunker wall. Raymond pulls the pin on a grenade, exhales, and rolls it through a small opening. The explosion shakes the structure. The firing stops. Nichols looks at him in disbelief. Nichols. You actually did it. Raymond grabs his arm. Raymond. Come on, more inside. They push into the bunker, clearing room by room until the last defender falls. Outside, the Marines surge forward, momentum shifting in their favor. Within an hour, the communications tower is seized. Mason orders charges planted at its base. The squad pulls back as the tower collapses in a thunderous crash, sending dust billowing skyward. The island quiets. For the first time in days, it feels like victory. Later, as the sun sets, the men rest near a captured trench. Raymond sits beside Nichols, both exhausted, filthy, barely able to lift their arms. Nichols. You saved my life today. Raymond. You saved mine last night. Nichols chuckles weakly. Nichols. Guess we're even then. Raymond looks toward the darkening jungle, thinking of home, of his mother, of the factory he once thought was the hardest part of his life. Raymond. We just keep going, one step at a time. The wind rustles through the broken palms. Smoke rises slowly into the fatting sky. Nichols leans back, closing his eyes. Nichols. If tomorrow's worse, don't let me be scared. Raymond. Everyone's scared, even Mason, even me. Albeit. Raymond. But we keep goings. The night settles over the island once more, quiet for now. The Marines prepare for the next phase, knowing this was only the beginning. Raymond grips his rifle, feeling the weight of everything they've survived, and everything yet to come. The jungle breathes in the darkness, holding its secrets. Raymond stares into it, ready for whatever waits in the shadows. The next morning, the island wakes to an eerie calm. The jungle, scorched and silent after the previous day's fighting, stretches endlessly. The Marines move cautiously, clearing debris and taking stock of what remains. Bodies are buried, wounded treated, and supplies redistributed. Every man wears exhaustion like a second skin. Raymond walks with Nichols along a narrow ridge, scanning the trees. Nichols glances at him, still pale from yesterday's fight. Nichols. You think this is it, the end? Raymond. And no, it never really ends, you just keep moving. Nichols nods, swallowing hard. Raymond knows what he means. This war feels endless, like a tide that never fully recedes. Days turn into weeks, the island is secured. Enemy resistance dwindles and the Marines rotate to other positions. Raymond writes a letter home, finally putting into words the things he's been carrying, the fear, the guilt, the moments of courage, the faces of men who never returned. He folds it carefully, addressing it to his mother. When the orders come to return home, Raymond feels a strange mix of relief and disbelief. The Pacific stretches before him, endless and blue, carrying him back across a world he barely recognizes anymore. Brooklyn welcomes him quietly. The streets smell the same, yet everything feels changed. Mary is waiting, older now, wrinkles deepened by worry and years, but she runs to him, arms wide. He falls into her embrace, holding her as tightly as he did the first time he saw her face after training, after war, after every night that seemed endless. Harris and Martinez are waiting too, older, grayer, but alive. They shake hands, clap shoulders, laugh in disbelief at having survived together. Stories are told, long and messy, and the weight of memories is shared like a private bond. Raymond returns to the factory briefly, seeing it as a bridge between his past and present. Machines hum in familiar rhythms, and for a moment he is just a young man again, tied to a simpler life. But he knows the war has changed him irrevocably. He will never be the same man who walked these streets before the Pearl Harbor headlines. He marries Alina. They raise Thomas and Margaret, teaching them the values he carried home: courage, empathy, and the quiet strength to act when no one is watching. He shares stories selectively, focusing on friendship, kindness, and the importance of helping others even in impossible circumstances. Years pass, Raymond grows older, walking the harbor at dawn, feeling the water beneath the pier ripple as it always did. Lucas's letters arrive, now written to his descendants, a connection across oceans born from a single act of mercy. The world changes, technology races forward, generations rise and fall. But Raymond's legacy, rooted in small acts of courage and compassion, persists. When he finally passes, peaceful in his sleep, the Sullivan family gathers by the harbor. Letters, photographs, and mementos of his life surround them. Lucas's family is present, his children and grandchildren joining the line of people who owe their lives in some small or large way to Raymond Sullivan's choices decades earlier. Thomas and Margaret speak of him as a man who embodied the quiet heroism of ordinary people, someone who faced unimaginable horrors yet chose humanity over hatred. Anne, standing by the pier, feels the weight and wonder of history in her hands. The stories of courage, fear, and love ripple outward once more, carried in memory and in the hearts of those who survive. The sun sets over Brooklyn Harbor, painting the water gold. And in that light, Raymond's presence seems to linger, not as a soldier or a hero of headlines, but as a man who lived fully, who loved fiercely, and who, in the darkest of times, chose compassion. The harbor hums softly, and for a moment the world feels whole again. The story ends not with the war, but with the quiet, enduring life that followed. The legacy of a single ordinary man who made an extraordinary difference.